Judge Prescott thought he could silence Pam Bondi with a fine. He never expected her to dismantle his entire argument in front of everyone. The courthouse in Tampa, Florida, had seen its fair share of legal battles. But on this particular morning, no one could have predicted the storm that was about to unfold. Pam Bondi, sharp as ever, stepped through the heavy wooden doors, briefcase in one hand, the other adjusting the lapel of her blazer. She was here for what should have been a routine hearing, one she could argue in her sleep. As she made her way to the defendant's table, she felt the judge's eyes on her before he even spoke. Judge Prescott, a man known for his no-nonsense demeanor, was staring not at her face but at something just below her collarbone. A simple gold cross. The air in the courtroom shifted. A quiet stillness. Then, in a tone as sharp as a gavel strike, Prescott cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Ms. Bondi, I must remind you that religious symbols have no place in my courtroom." Pam barely blinked. "Your Honor, you're wearing a cross that violates the neutrality of the space. You'll need to remove it or face a fine." A murmur rippled through the few spectators in attendance. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. The clerk darted a glance at the judge, then back at Pam. This wasn't the first time a judge had tried to assert control over his courtroom in an unusual way. But it was the first time anyone had thought to fine a lawyer over a necklace. Pam didn't move. "I'm sorry, Your Honor, but my cross is no different than a wedding ring or a locket with a family photo inside." Judge Prescott's face remained unreadable. "That's not how I see it." He sighed as if already growing tired of the discussion. "Either remove it or I'll have to issue a fine for disregarding courtroom neutrality." For the first time in her career, Pam Bondi found herself fined, not for misconduct, not for a procedural violation, but for wearing a piece of jewelry. The fine wasn't the issue, it was what it represented. She didn't take off the cross. Instead, she folded her hands over her briefcase, her expression cool. She wasn't about to let this go. "Your Honor, before we continue, I'd like to address this issue formally." Judge Prescott raised a brow. "Address it?" "Yes, I'll be filing an objection and would like to state my argument on record." The judge smirked, glancing at the clock on the wall. "Ms. Bondi, I'm sure you're aware that this hearing is about a business dispute, not your personal grievances." Pam didn't flinch. "I'm also aware that the First Amendment doesn't take a recess for personal opinions." That got his attention. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard. The room was now on edge, not because of a legal battle over a contract, but because a seasoned attorney had just challenged a judge's authority to his face. Pam knew she was walking a thin line, but backing down wasn't an option. "You're fining me for wearing a cross. Let's break that down legally, shall we?" The judge exhaled, rubbing his temples, but before he could respond, Pam was already reaching into her briefcase. She wasn't just going to argue, she was about to dismantle his entire premise. But Judge Prescott didn't realize just how deep of a hole he had started digging for himself. Pam pulled out a single sheet of paper from her briefcase, placing it carefully on the table in front of her. She didn't rush. Every movement was deliberate. Every second of silence was another tightening of the tension in the room. Judge Prescott sighed. "Ms. Bondi, I don't have time for theatrics." Pam didn't blink. "Neither do I, Your Honor. But what I do have is a firm understanding of constitutional law." The judge leaned forward, his fingers laced together as if bracing for whatever was coming next. "You're fining me for wearing a cross, claiming it violates courtroom neutrality. But tell me, Your Honor, what legal precedent are you basing that on?" The room was silent. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys. The bailiff barely shifted in his seat. Judge Prescott let out a slow breath. "This courtroom operates under my authority, Ms. Bondi." Pam nodded. "It does, but that authority is not above the Constitution." She tapped the paper in front of her. "And under the First Amendment, personal religious expression is protected, especially when it does not disrupt proceedings." The judge scoffed. "You're an attorney, not a law professor." Pam smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then let's talk case law, shall we?" She picked up the paper. Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969, a landmark case that established that individuals do not shed their constitutional rights when they enter a government institution, whether that's a school or a courtroom. Judge Prescott's jaw tightened just slightly. He knew that case. Everyone in the legal field did. Pam didn't stop. West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, 1943. The Supreme Court ruled that compelling individuals to remove or hide symbols of personal belief is a violation of their First Amendment rights. She set the paper down. Now, Your Honor, would you like me to keep going, or would you prefer to reconsider that fine? The judge's fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair. He was cornered, and he knew it, but his pride wouldn't let him concede, not yet. This is not a religious debate, Miss Bondi. Pam tilted her head. Then why did you make it one? A few quiet gasps broke out in the courtroom. Judge Prescott's face darkened. Enough. His voice was sharp, but his authority was slipping. Pam leaned forward, voice steady. With all due respect, Your Honor, I'll stop when I receive a legal justification for this fine, because so far I haven't heard one. A long pause. The judge finally looked at the clerk. Mark the fine as pending review. Pam smirked. I'll take that as a temporary victory, but she wasn't done yet. The real fight was just getting started. Judge Prescott's face remained unreadable, but there was no mistaking the way he shifted in his chair. He had expected a quiet compliance, not a full-blown constitutional challenge. The air in the courtroom was no longer just tense, it was electric. Pam could feel it. Every set of eyes was glued to her, watching, waiting. She had drawn a line in the sand, and now the judge had two choices: stand by his weak justification and risk humiliation, or find a way to backtrack without losing control. But Prescott wasn't one to back down easily. Ms. Bondi, he began, his tone measured. Courtroom rules exist for a reason. If I allow one form of personal expression, I open the door to all of them. Pam's lips pressed together. You mean like the wedding bands worn by half the attorneys here? Or the lapel pins you allow on government officials? Prescott's jaw tightened. Pam didn't let up. Or let's talk about the time you allowed a defense attorney to wear a pink ribbon for breast cancer awareness during a trial. You had no issue with that. A few quiet murmurs broke out among the observers. Prescott shot a glare toward them, but the damage was already done. Pam had just exposed his selective enforcement. Pam sat back, crossing her arms. So tell me, Your Honor, why does this rule apply only to my cross? Prescott's fingers curled around the edge of his desk. He was trapped, and everyone in that courtroom could see it. He had enforced an unwritten rule based on personal bias, and now it was crumbling beneath him. For the first time since the hearing began, he didn't have a response. Pam didn't need to gloat. She just let the silence stretch long enough for everyone to absorb the reality of the situation. Then, she delivered the final blow. If you stand by this fine, Your Honor, I will be filing an appeal before the ink dries on the ruling, and when that happens, I guarantee this case will make headlines. She let that sink in. A sitting judge fining a woman for wearing a cross in court. I'm sure the higher courts would love to weigh in on that precedent. Prescott's nostrils flared. His ego and pride were fighting a war against cold, hard reality. Pam didn't look away. She let him sit with it. The longer he delayed, the more obvious his mistake became. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he exhaled sharply. The fine is rescinded, he muttered. Pam smiled. Much appreciated, Your Honor. But this wasn't just about a fine anymore. She had just sent a message loud and clear, one that Prescott wouldn't forget anytime soon. But the fallout, that was only just beginning. The judge's words, the fine is rescinded, should have ended it. But the courtroom was no longer just a legal battleground. It was a spectacle, and everyone present had just witnessed something they weren't likely to forget. The court reporter barely looked up from her keyboard, but even she knew this transcript would circulate beyond this room. The clerk, who had initially looked uneasy when the fine was announced, now stole a quick glance at Pam, almost as if impressed. Judge Prescott shifted in his chair, straightening his papers as if he could physically erase the moment. But Pam knew better. This wasn't something he could brush aside. The silence was deafening. Pam calmly adjusted her blazer, the small gold cross still in place, exactly where it had been the entire time. She had won. But now she needed to make sure this wasn't just a personal victory. It had to mean something more. She turned to her client. a middle-aged business owner who had been the actual reason for this hearing. The man gave her a barely concealed nod of respect. His confidence in her only growing stronger. Pam knew this wasn't just about her anymore. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was immediate. A reporter, one who had been covering an entirely different case in the same building, caught wind of what had just unfolded. Within an hour, a local news website had posted the headline, "Florida Judge Attempts to Fine Attorney for Wearing a Cross, but It Doesn't Go as Planned." Pam's phone buzzed. Then again, and again. Colleagues, former law school classmates, journalists. People wanted to know what had just happened, but Pam wasn't interested in headlines or media spins. She had a bigger picture in mind. Her next step, taking this case beyond just one courtroom skirmish. She wasn't naive. She knew that cases like these had ripple effects, whether she intended them to or not. This wasn't just about a single judge and a single attorney anymore. This was a challenge to a precedent that hadn't yet been set, but very well could be. Would other judges attempt something similar? Would attorneys feel pressured to leave their personal symbols at the home to avoid confrontation? Would this moment embolden others to push the boundaries of courtroom neutrality in ways that targeted personal beliefs? Pam wasn't going to let that happen. By that evening, the story had already taken on a life of its own. A well-known legal commentator on a conservative news station brought it up during a panel discussion. On social media, heated debates broke out between those who supported the judge's stance and those who saw Pam's defiance as an important stand for constitutional rights. Pam sat in her office, watching the discussion unfold on her phone. A producer from a national news network had already reached out requesting an interview. She exhaled slowly, rubbing her temple. She had spent years fighting for clients, standing her ground in high-stakes cases, but this felt different, and this wasn't about corporate disputes or criminal defenses. This was about personal freedoms, and whether they could be stripped away on the whim of a single judge. But Judge Prescott wasn't done with her yet. She could sense it, even as she left the courthouse that day. The way he had looked at her before banging the gavel and dismissing the session. He might have rescinded the fine, but there had been something in his expression, an unspoken challenge. Pam wasn't sure what form it would take, but she knew this battle was far from over. Pam had expected some fallout, a few emails, maybe a couple of phone calls from colleagues weighing in. What she hadn't expected was the sheer speed at which everything escalated. By the time she walked into her office the next morning, her assistant Lauren was already waiting with a concerned expression. "You need to see this," she said, holding up her tablet. Pam took it, scanning the screen. The Florida Bar Association had just issued a statement, carefully worded, neutral in tone, but unmistakable in its implications. Judges have the right to maintain decorum in their courtrooms. While attorneys are afforded personal expression, it is important to respect the roles set forth by presiding judges. We trust our judicial system to navigate these matters with fairness and integrity. Pam let out a slow breath. This wasn't just a comment, this was a warning. The words "respect the rules set forth by presiding judges" weren't just a general statement, it was a signal. The legal world was tight-knit. The Florida Bar rarely commented on courtroom disputes unless they had reason to believe a situation was getting out of hand. This meant Prescott wasn't just bitter. He was already working behind the scenes to rally institutional backing. She set the tablet down. "This came out today?" Lauren nodded. "An hour ago." Pam wasn't surprised. The legal community was small. Word had traveled fast, and Prescott clearly wasn't taking this lightly. But before she could say another word, Lauren hesitated. "There's more," she said carefully. Pam glanced up, her expression unreadable. "Go on." Lauren handed her another document, this one printed. Pam skimmed the first few lines, her pulse steady but her mind racing. Attorney Pamela Bondi conducted herself in a manner that disrupted courtroom proceedings, challenged judicial authority inappropriately, and engaged in behavior unbecoming of an officer of the court. Pam couldn't help it. She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Unbecoming?" She shook her head. "That's rich," Lauren sighed. "It's retaliation, pure and simple." Pam leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the armrest. Prescott wasn't just looking for payback. He was trying to set an example. He had lost in his own courtroom, and now he was using the system to reassert his power. By filing this formal complaint, he was trying to flip the narrative. He was no longer the judge who overstepped his authority. He was painting himself as the one who had been disrespected. And Pam? He wanted to make her look like the reckless attorney who had challenged him just for the sake of challenging him. Pam had seen this move before. It was a common tactic. Turn the accuser into the accused. Reframe the story so the real issue got buried beneath bureaucracy and technicalities. But she wasn't about to let that happen. "What's the process on this?" she asked, already shifting gears. Lauren exhaled. "You'll have to respond within 10 days. If the complaint moves forward, they could conduct a formal review." Pam nodded slowly. "And who oversees that review?" Lauren hesitated. "A panel that includes judges and senior attorneys." Pam almost smiled. If Prescott was hoping to bury her in paperwork and quiet pressure, he had miscalculated, because this wasn't going to be handled quietly. This was about to become very public. Lauren studied her, waiting for her reaction. "What do you want to do?" Pam took a deep breath, then reached for her phone. "If Prescott wants to play games, let's play." She scrolled through her contacts, her mind already 10 steps ahead. Prescott thought she was going to defend herself in a closed-door hearing, accept a quiet reprimand, and move on. But he didn't understand who he was dealing with. Pam had spent her career playing the long game, and now she was about to make sure everyone was watching. Pam didn't waste time. She knew how these things worked. Retaliation was most effective when it happened in the shadows. Prescott wanted to handle this quietly, using the system against her while keeping the public in the dark. She wasn't about to let that happen. She scrolled through her phone, found the contact she needed, and pressed call. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Pam, I was just about to call you." It was Lisa Reynolds, a veteran journalist from a national legal affairs program. She had covered some of Pam's biggest cases before, and more importantly, she wasn't afraid to go after judicial overreach. Pam got straight to the point. "Lisa, I need you to listen carefully. A judge just filed a formal complaint against me for disrupting courtroom proceedings. But what really happened? He tried to fine me for wearing a cross, and when I stood my ground, he backed down. But now he's using the system to punish me instead." Lisa was silent for a moment. Then she let out a sharp breath. "You're telling me a sitting judge is trying to sanction you because you called out his abuse of power?" Pam smiled. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Lisa didn't hesitate. "I'm running this." Pam leaned forward. "I need it on record before they try to spin it. Once it's public, Prescott won't be able to twist this into a quiet disciplinary issue." Lisa was already on it. "I'll have a segment up by tomorrow, and I'll make sure legal analysts weigh in, especially ones who won't be afraid to call this out for what it is." Pam hung up, feeling the first stirrings of momentum shifting in her favor. But she wasn't done yet. She turned back to Lauren. "Draft a public statement. I want to make my position clear before Prescott and his allies try to muddy the waters." Lauren nodded. "You want to frame this as judicial overreach?" Pam shook her head. "I want to frame it as exactly what it is, an attack on personal rights and an abuse of judicial power. If this judge thinks he can punish me for standing up for myself, imagine what he's done to people who don't have a platform." Lauren's expression hardened. "I'll get it done." Pam exhaled, gathering her thoughts. Prescott had been counting on silence, but now the country was about to find out exactly what he had done. Pam didn't have to wait long. By the time she sat down with her coffee the next morning, her phone was already buzzing nonstop. News outlets had picked up Lisa Reynolds' segment overnight, and social media was ablaze. The headline was everywhere. "Florida judge attempts to punish attorney for wearing a cross. Now he's under fire." It wasn't just conservative outlets running the story. Legal analysts across the board, left, right, and center, were weighing in. A constitutional lawyer from Georgetown went on live television to tear Prescott's logic apart, calling it a blatant overreach that has no legal standing. Another high-profile attorney posted a thread dissecting how Pam's actions had exposed a dangerous precedent that needed to be addressed. And then came the statement Pam had been waiting for. The Florida Judicial Review Board announced that, due to the media attention, they would be reviewing Judge Prescott's conduct to determine whether his ruling had violated judicial ethics. Pam leaned back in her chair, exhaling. This was no longer just about her. This was about every attorney, every defendant, every person who had ever stepped into a courtroom, wondering whether their rights could be stripped away with the stroke of a judge's pen. Lauren walked in, holding up her phone. "You're going to want to see this." Pam took it and pressed play. It was Prescott. He was standing outside the courthouse, cameras flashing around him, his expression stiff. The statement was short, too short for someone trying to defend himself. "I have always upheld the integrity of this courtroom. The actions taken were in the interest of maintaining neutrality. However, I respect the judicial review process and will cooperate fully." Pam almost laughed. Neutrality? He was still trying to play that card? Lauren crossed her arms. "He's trying to save face." Pam nodded, and failing. Because this wasn't going away. The Judicial Review Board had a decision to make. If they ruled against Prescott, it wouldn't just be a professional embarrassment. It would set a precedent, one that protected people like Pam from ever facing this kind of retaliation again. But even if they didn't formally reprimand him, he had already lost where it mattered most: his reputation, his credibility, his authority. Because after this, every attorney who walked into his courtroom would know. This was the judge who tried to silence someone and lost. Pam took a slow sip of her coffee, then looked up at Lauren. "We won." Lauren smirked. "Oh, I know." Pam set her cup down. She hadn't just fought for herself. She had sent a message. Never let someone in power strip away your rights without a fight. Because sometimes all it takes is one person standing their ground to change everything. If you believe in standing up for your rights, make sure your voice is heard. Like, comment, and subscribe for more real stories that matter.